Hi, everybody. Welcome. Um, Welcome to those in virtual space as well as physical space. And if our Zoomers could make a comment if they cannot hear us, that would be useful. I think everybody can hear out there in cyberspace. And welcome to everybody here. Great to have you back. This is week five. I was going to guess 5. Thank you. This is week 5 of the workshop in the history of material texts, and we are steaming through this semester, and we are delighted to have some friends and guests from relatively far away this week. So we have long distance travel. We also have some particularly excellent books on display, which I commend to your attention. I'll mention those again in a second. Sorry, Zoomers, you'll have to come to Penn to see them. For those of you newish to this operation, this is the workshop in the history of material texts, week 5. I'm John Pollack. I'm one of the co-organizers of this seminar with Zach Lesser from the English department and Jerry Singerman, Emeritus Humanities Editor at the Penn Press, and Priya Nambrath, our graduate student assistant, who manages the listserv. For those of you who are not on our email list and would like to be, the sign-in sheet is either going around or sitting on a cart nearby. Okay, thank you. And you're welcome to sign yourselves in, and we will get a little bit of email from us. Brief announcement, without meaning to embarrass Priya unnecessarily. Thanks to one of our inside information sources. She is the winner of an important essay prize from the Society of South Asia Studies, recently announced in Heidelberg. So cheers to Priya. We also opened a new exhibit in the Kislak Center just last Friday called Reinventing Aristotle. I'm happy to see a bunch of classicists in the room today and in the front of the room. And there is actually a connection to tonight's talk in a kind of a way. So that exhibit is curated by Eva Del Soldato in Italian, Hannah Marcus, Penn undergraduate now in History of Science at Harvard, and Lynn Farrington. And the show is up through the end of the term in the Goldstein Gallery.
I think it's up through early January.
Even into the new year. Okay, if we all make it that far. And any other announcements?
Tomorrow we will be having our new acquisition showcase here in this space between the hours of 2 and 6 p.m. So if you get a chance, stop by to see some of the new things we've acquired over the last year.
A new acquisition showcase is essentially a giant open house where we fill the tables with all the cool things that have come in.
Some of the cool things.
Many cool things. A wide smorgasbord of cool things. And you can come anytime during those hours. There's no formal program. We are here to let you look and answer questions and kind of enjoy it. So that's tomorrow afternoon. But tonight, before we get there, I am really happy to kind of welcome what I'm thinking of as a 2 for the price of 1 scholarly duo here. Dee Andrews on my right and Chris Parmenter on my left. What's I think exciting, as you'll hear about this, this is exactly the kind of cross-disciplinary scholarly conversation that Peter Stallybrass up there envisioned that this seminar was meant to do, and that's what we're going to be doing. So I have known Dee for quite a while now, actually. She's a regular visitor. Some of you know that very well. Everyone, well, maybe not everybody. Some will get to know you. Dee has been, of course, a frequent visitor to the McNeil Center for Early American Studies here. She's Professor Emerita of History at California State University, East Bay. But I think we can say her heart is centered here on the East Coast. She frequents our many libraries and archives, participates regularly in this seminar, and as those of you in the room can see, has curated, I would call this a Stalibrasian size presentation of books for us to examine, including descriptive labels, an unusual extra step in our work. So please do have a look at those images and books. We'll talk about them. Dee's monograph from the year 2000, which is called The Methodist and Revolutionary America, won numerous awards and is really fundamental reading for those investigating the aftermath of the Great Awakening and the religious culture of the revolutionary and early Republican eras in the United States. In that book, she traces how popular religiosity of the Methodist preachers attracted women and men and people of many, many races and ethnicities up and down the social scale. Her work emphasizes that Methodism could represent a truly revolutionary and even emancipatory path for its adherents. And she also teaches us an important lesson that the American revolution of religion was every bit as fundamental as that in the political realm. After that investigation of Methodism, Dee turned logically to abolitionism in the colonial era and the early republic with a focus on the Quaker communities, and she's been working on these projects for a long time. She published an important essay on Thomas Clarkson with Emma Lapsansky-Werner, first presented at a conference here at Penn called On Quakers and Slavery, back over a decade ago. She studied the manuscript of Clarkson's History of the Abolition of the Slave Trade, which is, if I'm not mistaken, at Haverford. Am I right, Sarah? Yes, I'm right. And pointed out Clarkson's use of a revolutionary copying paper technology, I believe, in his work on that book, a pre-Xerox moment. And she's also published an important essay entitled From Natural Rights to National Sins on the conflicted and ambivalent responses by the Philadelphia churches to slavery's expansion in the first decades of the 19th century. So that's Dee. And on my left, I've just recently met Chris, who is assistant professor in Department of Classics at The Ohio State University. And I'm just becoming acquainted with his recent work on race in antiquity and how theories of ancient slavery were interpreted and reinterpreted between the 18th through the 20th centuries. I do commend to you Chris's 2024 article in TAPA, which is the Journal Society for Classical Studies, and that is entitled, But They Were a Race of Whites, Race and the Making of Ancient Slavery in the Anglophone World, 1785-1980. In that article, Chris surveys theories of enslavement in Anglo-America beginning in the Revolutionary era, arguing that ancient slavery provided powerful ammunition for the defenders of slavery in the American South. And it's only in the 20th century, Chris suggests provocatively, that classicists created a version of ancient slavery that could be understood, they thought, as non-racial in character. And also last year, it was a big year, Chris published what I think promises to be a groundbreaking book on this topic with Oxford called Racialized Commodities, Long-Distance Trade, Mobility, and the Making of Race in Ancient Greece, 700 to 300 BCE. And here Chris tackles a profound intellectual problem, whether the category of race may be applied to ancient societies, in particular to archaic Greece during its commercial expansion in the Mediterranean, which brought Greeks into contact with peoples across vast areas and provoked new reflections on cultures and a categorization of human beings. So he tests the uses and limits of these terms, ethnicity and race, to understand Greek worldviews. Now, I hope and I expect that his book will be read closely by early modernists, because Chris is also advancing a thesis about the emergence of racialized thinking in a time of expanding trade and merchant culture. Perhaps not quite yet the world of global capitalism, but nevertheless a powerful and important parallel context, something to debate. So clearly there's a lot to think over here. And as I mentioned, it's particularly fortuitous that Chris is joining us just days after our exhibit, Reinventing Aristotle, has opened. That exhibit engages with some of the same important questions about Aristotle's theories of natural slavery and the deployment of those theories from the Renaissance to the present. So that's a lot of background, but I thought it was important because we're delighted to have Chris here together to present to us their essay tonight, Thomas Clarkson's Latin essay, Radical Anti-Slavery, Classical Reception, and Abolitionist Print in the Age of Revolution. Please join us in welcoming.
Well, thank you for your kind introduction. Both Dee and I are truly flattered to be here with you this evening. I should just preface this by saying that this is an overview of our two-volume project on the early work of Thomas Clarkson in both Latin and English, currently under peer review. And so hopefully this will be coming to a shelf near you in the next speed of academic publishing. So I'm going to begin by talking about the Latin and the classical background of Clarkson's anti-slavery project. And I'll talk to you for about 15 minutes, and then Dee will take over with the remaining aspects of the project. And of course, fine exhibition that she put together of books from here at Penn. So let me begin. The history of Anglophone social movements arguably begins with abolition. Between circa 1784 and up to 1793, a coalition of intellectuals, religious dissenters, bourgeois consumers, industrialists, sailors, and formerly enslaved Africans waged a campaign to abolish the transatlantic slave trade in British Parliament. Coordinating this movement was SEAST, or the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, a subscription-based organization that orchestrated an unprecedented drive of mass petitions, pamphleteering, and lobbying. Now, every cause has its myths. Perhaps the central figure in the first abolition movement was Thomas Clarkson, a radical Anglican priest and co-founder of SEAST. Clarkson's origin story manifested a certain romantic sensibility. By his own reckoning, the naive and apolitical Clarkson was first introduced to the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade in 1785, when he entered and won a Latin essay contest at Cambridge on the topic of "On Liceat Nolentes in Servitutem Dare," or whether it's permissible to force the unwilling into slavery. Shocked by his discoveries, he translated, rewrote, and vastly expanded his prize-winning essay into the essay on the commerce of the human species, particularly the African. Now, when Clarkson joined abolition, it was a fringe movement dominated by Quakers. But Clarkson imbued abolition with the authority of Cambridge, the classics, and the church. Over the following decade, Clarkson ran an exhausting operation that combined scholarship, activism, journalism, and politics. He was in Paris in 1789, where he directly participated in the early stages of both the French and the Haitian revolutions. After 7 years of frantic activism, Clarkson's world collapsed in 1793. By this point, Clarkson's movement had foundered in Parliament. He was broke. His friends in France and Haiti were mostly dead. His friends in England were fleeing political repression, and he suffered a debilitating nervous breakdown. Now, Thomas Clarkson's origin story was as a Latin author. Many historians of abolition have always regarded Clarkson's Latin essay as something like a celebrated curiosity, but nothing more than that. After all, by the 1780s, Latin comprised a negligible portion of British literary output. What exactly could be the value of a Latin draft? In our forthcoming book, Dee and I position On Liceat as a key development in the transition of English historical thought from its humanist roots into a new empirical mode of social analysis. Clarkson is actually famous for this, as his central project in life was the journalistic documentation of the transatlantic slave trade. But when Clarkson writes in Latin, he nearly exemplifies the culture that Stuart McManus calls late humanism, interpreting slavery not as an economic problem, as he would in his English writing, but as a moral problem. Beginning with a long disquisition on ancient slavery, Clarkson assails thinkers who defend slavery on the basis of civil law, the tradition of European jurisprudence stemming from the digest of the Roman Emperor Justinian. On Liceat sees Rome not as a source of wisdom, but as a barbarous force that must be displaced. The transformation of his essay from a Latin moral tract into an English language treatise on political economy mirrored a broader shift in historiography from moral enterprise to the pursuit of the fact. My half of our presentation explores how and why Thomas Clarkson made his revolt against the ancients, and more to the point, why a contest essay from 1785 matters today. Let me begin with an overview of the manuscript before turning to what it really means. Liceat Invitos in Servitutem Dare is part of the Thomas Clarkson papers held by the Robert W. Woodruff Library at Atlanta University Center, Atlanta, Georgia. This manuscript exists in two copies, Manuscript A up here on the left and Manuscript B. Manuscript A is written in gall ink on unlined paper, comprises 28 pages. Manuscript A is the product of three hands, a rapid and inconsistent hand, a more careful hand, and finally own Clarkson's easily recognizable hand, which supplied the block-quoted Greek and Latin text. Manuscript A is fascinating because it includes many crossouts and emendations, almost as though it was a rough draft, although technically speaking, it lacks the morphological errors in Latin and Greek found in Manuscript B. At the top is a heart-touching inscriptions to Clarkson's grandson, where he urges the boy to change the world. Manuscript B, up here on the right, is made in a secretarial hand, quite possibly submitted to Cambridge for the prize. It conspicuously lacks Clarkson's name, and we know this contest was judged anonymously. This manuscript has occasional morphological errors and hypercorrections in the Latin and Greek, but no crossouts or emendations, and all of the quoted Greek lacks diacritics, as you can see here down at the bottom of the right. Manuscript A is burned along the outer edges. We know that Clarkson burned perhaps most of his papers in successive purges in the last decade of his life. We believe that Manuscript A survived one of these purposeful destructions. Our book includes the first ever critical text and translation of Clarkson's essay. From an editorial perspective, this was an exceptionally easy text to edit. There's only two manuscripts and they basically agree. Our editorial choices were thus prosaic. Our critical text preserves much of the manuscript's eccentricity. An unusual choice made by my co-author and I was to use a professional translator. Prior to my joining this project in 2022, Dee had commissioned Hannah Rich, who's sitting in the back here, who was then one of Emily Wilson's graduate students at Penn, to produce a stylized 18th century style literary translation of the manuscripts. We kept Hannah's translation because it's completely brilliant. While some readers will appreciate a prosaic literality in translation, Rich's approach, which John Dryden might have called translation with latitude, captures how English speakers might have processed written Latin in the 18th century. I emphasize this point because the text punctuation and capitalization was clearly that of 18th century English, and to some extent the word order as well. A modern translation would not have been very appropriate. Now, I'll talk a little bit about his style, and really just a little bit, because to the non-Latin readers here, this is kind of boring. Generally speaking, Clarkson's style is approachable and easily recognizable for those of you who've taken Latin prose comp. Most of Clarkson's prose is the bland stuff of Caesar and Cicero, unless you work on Caesar and Cicero, in which case it's not bland at all. Actually, very exciting. He writes in these long periodic sentences marked by parallelism, chiastic word order, consistent adherence to the sequence of tenses, and sometimes extreme separation between nouns and verbs. But in moments of rhetorical intensity, Clarkson adopts mannerisms better associated with Sallust and Tacitus. This is a style characterized by use of reversal, bitter irony, and abbreviation. For instance, section 28 here on the slide, where Clarkson writes, "Imo potius ut princeps de vitiis augeator, quanto en imploro sunt crimina civium tanto ditior princeps, tanto hic felicior, quanto nequiores elli." No, it is more so that the leader might gain in wealth. For the more crimes the citizens commit, the richer the leader becomes. He is happier the more wicked they are. So that type of moral discourse. Now, before jumping further into the text, I should provide you with a rundown of its contents. The text begins by overviewing the history of slavery from the ancient Greeks to the present. Moving on, Clarkson disputes the legitimacy of slavery under natural law. He debates an imaginary defender of the slave trade, and he concludes with a harrowing depiction of the Middle Passage, which unfortunately we won't actually look at today. And I say this because this unique and truly awful depiction is one of the most shocking and certainly most unique thing probably ever written in the language. But now some background as to what Clarkson's mission is here with the classics. Greece and Rome were central to Thomas Clarkson's abolitionism in ways that might seem puzzling today. Educated discourse in the 18th century Anglo-American world was characterized by what various scholars have called a culture of classicism or a culture of taste that valued nearly everything in reference to Greek, Roman, or biblical antiquity. Antiquity was both a field of knowledge in itself and a political battleground, a space where contemporary debates might be allegorized into a framework of shared reference. From this perspective, some of Clarkson's odder choices in rhetoric make a little more sense. We see him variously making these completely ridiculous points that someone like Achilles or St. Augustine were actually abolitionists. If you just read hard enough, it becomes true. On the other hand, he makes some rather sophisticated comparisons between the non-state societies of contemporary West Africa with the Germans and Scythians of classical ethnography. As such, Clarkson straddled a critical divide in the history of scholarship, with one foot planted in an antiquarian mode, and the second that conceived of history as a sequence of facts. Now, Thomas Clarkson was product of an education that valued rhetorical dexterity above basically everything else. Clarkson had entered the culture of classicism at a young age, attending St. Paul's School in London on a scholarship. As late as the 1830s, Latin was still taught at St. Paul's using a humanist approach. The core text was a Latin grammar written in Latin, first published by William Lilly in 1535. Boys were drilled in Latin composition using Erasmus of Rotterdam's De Copia Verborum. And I should emphasize that these were 8 and 9-year-olds handling books that were 300 or 400 years old by that point. So, yeah. By the time that Clarkson arrived at St. John's College, Cambridge in 1781, Latin language was no longer the language of instruction. Nonetheless, the university still examined students in the argumentative style of Latin humanism. One annual ritual were examinations known as the Tripos, conducted orally up to 1770 and in writing thereafter. Similar were periodic essay contests for cash prizes. In both, examinees would respond to prompts based on preset reading lists. These lists were remarkably conservative. Well past Clarkson's time, the university still drew questions from a Latin language handbook first published by Thomas Johnson in 1735. Students were expected to be fluent in Dutch jurisprudence, Restoration-era debates over the governance of the Anglican Church, and more than anything else, John Locke and his theory of property. All of these things appear in the reading lists for the now lost exams sought by Clarkson prior to the 1785 contest. And here's some pictures that Dee took, in fact, of some of Clarkson's exams at Cambridge, barely legible from where you're sitting. But clearly you can see up there Locke, Cicero Philippics, Tacitus Germania, and so on and so forth. The structure of Clarkson's essay was narrowly tailored to meet the standards of a Latin language exercise known as a disputatio. According to a 1649 manual that was republished in Johnson's handbook, 2 disputants should debate a premise, one proposing a thesis and the other an antithesis. The 2 then gather evidence from authoritative sources, either classical or from a preset reading of early modern theorists, to further their proposition. Disputants could not question the words of an authority. Rather, they must find another authority on which to stake an antithesis. Finally, disputants must be vigilant that their arguments not simply prevail by rhetorical style, but also from a logical perspective. All of this goes a long way in explaining what would be the obvious inadequacies in much of Clarkson's argument. Humanist scholarship could be about right or wrong, but often it really wasn't. The point was that the past was a storehouse of moral examples that was yours to freely pilfer. I'd like to end my section of the presentation by summarizing Clarkson's argument as briefly as I can. Clarkson believes that slavery cannot be permissible under natural law. Nature's basic principle is happiness. Acts that increase human joy are positive, and those that inflict misery are negative. All of the world's peoples are equal in their ability to express pleasure and pain from antiquity to today. Therefore, Any attempt to justify slavery via natural law requires us to deny the humanity of enslaved people. This argument was a striking departure from the Latin jurisprudence that Clarkson had read at Cambridge. Clarkson's main target in On Liceat is Florentinus, the Roman jurist whose rationalization for slavery would prove foundational in Roman law and the tradition that followed. In Digest 154, Florentinus is excerpted explaining that, quote, freedom is the natural power of doing whatever anyone wishes to do unless he is prevented in some way by force or by law. Slavery is an institution of the law of nations, jus gentium, by means of which anyone may subject one man to the control of another, contrary to nature. Slaves, servi, are so called for the reason that military commanders were accustomed to sell their captives, and in this matter preserve them, servati in Latin, instead of putting them to death. They are styled monicipia because they are taken from the hands, manus, of their enemies. Florentinus' rationalization for slavery was generally accepted across the early modern period. All people are free in the eyes of natural law, but it's permissible for someone to be enslaved under a carve-out known as the law of nations, jus gentium. During the height of the Habsburg Empire in the early 17th century, Florentinus' definition appealed to Northwestern European jurists because it effectively limited Iberian fantasies that any non-Catholic was a natural slave, a doctrine borrowed at some distance from Aristotle's Politics. A line of jurists beginning with the Dutch jurist Hugo Grotius around 1600 and ending with John Locke a century later embraced this definition. According to these thinkers, it was only permissible to enslave convicts, debtors, or captives taken in a justly declared war, mainly for self-defense. A more prickly but generally accepted carve-out was that, following Roman law, all these thinkers agreed that slavery should be heritable. Such rationalizations were commonly cited by defenders of the transatlantic slave trade well past 1800. Clarkson takes direct aim at Grotius and Locke's acceptance of the Roman position. Clarkson echoes Florentinus at the beginning. He says, in the first place, it is clear from reason and from the history of those nations which most closely approach a state of nature that all men are equally free and have an equal right to the earth and the fruits of the earth. And skipping forward a little bit, liberty must be held to be a natural human right, but authority must be held to be adventitious because all men from the beginning are equally free. He puts quotation marks around that. That's not actually a quote. Like Florentinus, Clarkson believes that all people have liberty by nature. But in Clarkson's Latin, you'll find the repetition of this troublesome little adverb, aeque, or equally, and the repetition of the noun use, which our translator, Hannah Rich, reads, in my mind correctly, as right. This belief in intrinsic human rights, grounded in the individual and not in the broader society, is the classic language of the Enlightenment. But it's striking how different this position is from the one held by Florentinus, Grotius, or Locke, all of whom regarded liberty as a natural characteristic of human beings, but not an entitlement. What happened? It would be easy and correct to say that Clarkson was incensed by the defenders of the transatlantic slave trade, who were using a flimsy legal justification from Roman law to justify the mass deportation of innocent men, women, and children from Africa to the Americas. But this does not explain why Clarkson, who'd been thoroughly drilled in 17th century jurisprudence, would have believed that liberty was an entitlement. Clarkson had taken this apparatus from Francis Hutcheson, the proto-utilitarian Scottish philosopher of the early 18th century who was a major presence on Cambridge reading lists. According to Hutcheson, the principle of nature is feeling, or sententia. All people, including enslaved people, are born with a conscience. This conscience, which is a property of the soul, can perceive the inherent rationality of nature. We feel good when other people are happy, and we don't feel good when people are not happy. Therefore, that which spreads the greatest amount of joy is in accordance with natural law, and that which spreads misery is not. Thus, in Clarkson's estimation, governments arose from the state of nature to maximize happiness, which he calls in several places the foundation of rule, patet felicitatem esse fundamentum imperii, as he says in section 18. People can only be happy if they are least constrained by authority, which limits some aspects of natural liberty for the benefit of all. Because people are intrinsically born free, liberty is inalienable in states that adhere to natural law. Therefore, you can only justify enslaving Africans if their humanity is unequal to Europeans. And so that's the background of Clarkson's project. Now I'm going to hand things over to my co-author, Dee. And as part of this, I'm going to switch the presentation.
Oops.
Just use the arrows.
So, so I'm going to do a bit of a guide through this second half of this PowerPoint about what happened after the essay won the Members Prize, as it was called, at Cambridge, and then was published in a volume called Essay on the Slavery and Commerce of the Human Species, particularly the African, in 1786 by James Phillips, a major Quaker abolitionist publisher in London and part of the CS group of abolitionists there. So I'm going to mention that briefly, but then go on rather than going into the contents of that much longer much longer tract, much longer than the Latin essay, and quite different from the Latin essay in many spots. To talk about how people, what Clarkson did for a while there, how people reacted to Essay on the Slavery, the published edition, and then why did people continue to talk about the Latin essay? You'll see, for a very long time. So to move forward, here's Essay on the Slavery and Commerce of the Human Species, as I say, was published by Phillips in 1786 with reference to the Latin essay prominently on the title page. Translated from Latin dissertation, et cetera, it's right there on the title page. This included a text 256 pages long. Now, the manuscript is 45 paragraphs long. So a lot was added here. It took the form of a preface and 3 parts. Part 1 being the history of slavery, which was 8 chapters long. Part 2, the African commerce or slave trade, 9 chapters long. And part 3, which was a fully half of the essay on the slavery of the Africans in the European colonies, that's 11 chapters long, which was brand new virtually. Most of we have traced the Latin essay in the text. It follows the same order, the same argument, but most of it appears in part 1 and part 2. And then he adds this whole additional section based on a lot of contemporary work and controversies over slavery and slave trade. So I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to move on to what happened with this edition and the responses. So Philadelphia and Dublin, printers in Philadelphia and Dublin rapidly reprinted the essay. Philadelphia's printer was Joseph Cruikshank, publisher for the Philadelphia Quaker Yearly Meeting, and one of the early publishers of Phyllis Wheatley, I might add. And in Dublin, Patrick Byrne, who was a member of the United Irishmen, a radical reformer in Dublin, picked up the essay as well. Byrne later migrated to Philadelphia in the footsteps of Matthew Carey, who I'll mention again in a few minutes. So it's very revealing that a political radical in Dublin would think this was, a suitable text, and that's typical of the time. Clarkson, in these years, beginning with the essay on the slavery, based on the Latin essay, to 92, was very prolific. He published more than 1,100 pages in print, nearly all published by James Phillips, virtually all taking the form of kind of proto-investigative journalism. This is a bit of a thesis we're playing around with, based on primary research, testimony, witnesses, travel, and then trying to reveal the inner workings of the slave trade. He also wrote nearly 350 pages in manuscript in the form of bound résumés, composed in London and translated for the Comte de Mirabeau, 1789-90, when Clarkson was living in Paris. He was always there. He was always at the center of the action at the very beginning of the French Revolution. So these résumés are essentially books, but they're in manuscript. Here's a portrait by Carl Frederick van Breda, Swedish portrait painter who was working in London, 1788. Clarkson's holding what appears to be a manuscript copy of his next major essay, Essay in the Impolicy of the African Slave Trade. Strong political economic shift going on here in his work. And it's resting on a notebook of statistical tables, an interesting symbol in that the artist chose to put there. This is a man who knows the facts. That's essentially what's implied here. Then there's just to refer to a little bit more about what Clarkson was up to. There are the power of images, which were a major factor in abolitionist work and polemics. On the left from the, oops, it's crooked for some reason. On the left, it's turned around. Sorry, you should be able to see that. That's odd. Is a picture of shackled legs. I'm sorry, you can't see it, but it's replicated on the right. Am I looking at it right? Yeah. This is from the Huntington Library, his English letters to Mirabeau, and on the right is from the Rasool translated from Mirabeau, which used some of the same drawings. So we can see that Clarkson himself is literally making drawings for the purposes of his publications. And finally, the Brooks engraving, which is right over there, if you want to see it at the end of the presentation. Probably, wouldn't you say, Chris, the most famous image in all of abolition? I think everybody knows about this. Whenever I talk to somebody and say, there's that painting of the slave, the print of the slave ship, they all know what I'm talking about, whether or not they study any of this stuff. And this is a good example of how valuable they thought these images were. I can tell you about the Brooks if you want to later, but for the time being, what's interesting here is it's in an enclosure in a very cheap tract that Clarkson wrote called Abstract of the Evidence. He wrote it for the London Society again. And they thought it was so valuable that they put an expensive engraving even in the cheap edition, 1792. I'd also like to point out this tract traveled from Lincolnshire, England to Sacramento, California in the course of the 19th century and is now a part of the special collections at my very own campus, just coincidentally. And a little reminder to all of us who are interested in the transmission of ideas that people carrying around their books with them was another way that these ideas were distributed. Clearly a treasured item by Mary Courtois, the owner. Then to turn then to these four examples of responses to the Latin essay, and this gives you some example of how varied, how differently people read this again is the long essay in print, not knowing really that very little of it was based on the Latin essay. Well, the fundamental structure is the Latin essay, but all this other stuff was added. But they nevertheless had strong reactions to it here. The first is Benjamin Rush. I assume most people know who he is, major American revolutionary and an abolitionist, also an evangelical Christian, by the way, and worked a lot with Black people and Black leaders in Philadelphia. And he focuses on the salvation of slaves and the spreading of the word by print. And in this, it's something called The Paradise of Negro Slaves, a Dream. He submitted this to Matthew Carey, there we go, for the Columbian magazine, and there's a copy over there on the table, to report a dream he had after reading Thomas Clarkson's essay. By the way, there's a wonderful article about this. If anybody's interested, I'm happy to tell you about that. Not by me, by a scholar in a collection on Benezet. And he has this dream that he walks into this heaven, a halfway house heaven, so to speak, a waiting room heaven for Black people. I seldom dream, he says, when I do seldom dream of anything worthy of attention to the public. Soon after reading Mr. Clarkson's ingenious and pathetic, meaning moving, essay on the slavery and commerce of human species, the subject made so deep an impression on me, that upon my mind, that it followed me in my sleep and produced a dream of so extraordinary in nature that I have yielded to the importunities of some of my friends to whom I communicated it by requesting a place for it in your magazine. So in effect, Clarkson's essay entered Benjamin Rush's unconscious, and he reports this dream. I can also explain later, if anybody's interested, why there would be a halfway house to heaven for slaves. It's not because they're not worthy. I can explain that further. But he describes this, and then he says, and in comes this small man carrying a petition in one hand and a brief tract in the other. Lo and behold, it's the ghost of Anthony Benezet. Benezet was the major leading abolitionist in Philadelphia at this time, and he was a very important author for Clarkson. One of his books is right there, signed by Anthony Benezet on the table. And he, a very influential figure on many, many levels. And so Anthony Benezet's a logical person to enter into Benjamin Rush's dream, carrying with him print material for distribution. Then there is the fascinating work of Otoba Cuguano, a Atlantic Creole, formerly kidnapped from Africa, freed and from Grenada in the West Indies, living in London, working as a servant in the household of Richard Cosway, the London artist. This is a print that Cosway did, an etching that Cosway did, and likely this is Cuguano, who's a well-known figure certainly in the Black community in London, and this is likely a picture of him. He published Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evil and Wicked Traffic of Slavery and Commerce with Human Species, a direct homage to Clarkson's essay, and he quotes him a number of times here in his work. Scholars have described Cuguano's work as an anti-slavery Jeremiad of volcanic ferocity. It's a remarkable piece, inspired a lot by his Calvinist beliefs. He's an early Calvinist thinker and abolitionist from the Lady Huntingdon's connection in London. There are a lot of Black people who've been influenced by the Calvinist Whitfieldian Methodism, and he writes this piece with not any big text, with any number of references to what should be done in the future that actually did occur in various ways, including finding some kind of peace between whites and Blacks after the tragedy and horrors of slavery. This was rapidly translated into French. He independently published it by subscription, rapidly translated into French. A copy is on the table over there from the Kislak collection. This was done by Brissot de Warville in London, who was a major abolitionist, and in Paris, sorry, who was a major abolitionist. Though note, it was published in I'm not quite sure how to pronounce this, Neuchâtel, someone should correct me, where a lot of radical Parisian work was published because it was censored in Paris. So this applied to this as well. Then there is, intriguingly, another take by Gilbert Franklin, who was an investor in the West Indian plantations and an agent for the West India Interest, which was the lobbying pro-slavery group for Parliament, lobbying for Parliament. He was a powerful agent in that figure, and seemingly, I'll take Chris's judgment here, a pretty good classicist, somebody who seemed to have been educated, likely at Cambridge or Oxford. It's not clear from his biography where he went to school, but he talks about Clarkson's credentials and the limits of freedom. And this long subtitle says, in a series, this is my remarks, in a series of letters from a gentleman, me, Franklin, in Jamaica, to his friend in London, wherein many of the mistakes and misrepresentations of Mr. Clarkson are pointed out, both with regard to the manner in which the commerce is carried on in Africa and the treatment of slaves in the West Indies. Clarkson's wrong about all this, showing at the same time the antiquity, universality, and lawfulness of slavery, to follow on Chris's remarks, the antiquity, universality, and lawfulness of slavery as ever having been one of the states and conditions of mankind. It's always been with us. It's not going anywhere. This is his argument. And in some respects, Franklin had a point, given that Clarkson's essay is woven through the published edition, but not set aside, and the published edition, it's got all this other stuff in it. And he implies that his Cambridge examining board would not have given him the prize had they read what he wrote in the published edition, which was increasingly radical. Unfortunately for Franklin, Peter Packard, who was vice chancellor at Cambridge, who administered the prize, was very proud of Clarkson's published work. And he wrote in a sermon a couple of years later, right before Franklin wrote, he overtly attributes his own larger emancipationist goals to end slavery itself to Clarkson's work. Thus, through him, this is the teacher speaking to the student, thus, through him, I look upon myself as in some small degree a promoter of the glorious attempt to set the slave at liberty. This is the Vice Chancellor of Cambridge giving the green light, the award, so to speak, to Clarkson's ideas. What's perhaps more interesting or intriguing about Franklin is that the pro-slavery people had no idea what they sounded like when they said things like, it sounds sort of liberal. They say, well, slavery is not about race. We're not racist we would say in our language. We're not, because there's always been slavery and anybody could be a slave. And here you have an increasingly literate English population, increasingly conscious of the injustices of the slave trade and slavery, increasingly sharing these things in book groups and book clubs, which is essentially what Siest was a big book club. And they're reading that anybody could be a slave, and that's okay. They were totally out of touch with what was going on with public opinion in Britain at the time. Finally, there's John Blakey's book from the Clement Library at Michigan. And here he's interested in Christian sympathy and the multiracial future, if we want to put it that way, as kind of a bit of an interpretive reading, but I'll show you what I mean. John Blakey, signing up here, owned the Philadelphia edition of Essay on the Slavery. He appears to have been, from what I can tell, a Northern Virginian. There were two John Blakeys in the Blakey family in Northern Virginia. I'm sure it's one of these men, and I suspect it's the non-slaveholder. And I don't say that because slaveholders didn't read this stuff. Everybody was reading it. There's a slaveholding John Blakey and a non-slaveholding John Blakey in Northern Virginia. I believe it's the non-slaveholding one, given his the passion of his response to Clarkson's essay. For example, he marks spots. He marks 48 passages in Essay on the Slavery with little hands in a cuff. This is important. This is important. This is important. Here's a good example of his commentary at the bottom, remarking on a battle over seizing slaves in West Africa. What is too bad for white people to do, he says. They are the worst devils to the Negroes. First, a kind of a statement of shock. Then he comments on Clarkson's Clarkson has a set dialogue between an African and an Englishman, where the Englishman is trying to say to the African, we're really good people. We really are good people. We're good Christians, believe me. And he paraphrases Clarkson here. The real Christian is an amiable man, such an 18th century remark. It's wonderful. Christianity is the best morality. He's paraphrasing what Clarkson says in this passage from the essay. There's another one. Clarkson's discussion of the origin of species. Was it monogenic or polygenic? If it was monogenic, it was everyone is equal, descended from Adam and Eve. If it's polygenic, there are different creations of the different races, and there's a racial hierarchy in the world. And Clarkson obviously says it's monogenic, I believe, and there's a big literature on this at the time. And he writes, Blakey writes, which proves to a demonstration that the Negroes are our brothers, all one stock. A statement of racial equality right there on the page. And finally, he reports a little anecdote. This is at the bottom of a passage where Clarkson's talking about the London Black community who he's been talking with and interviewing, who say, there is such, people's color can change. Of course, usually what they're referring to is the children of mixed race unions. But Clarkson cites this as a proof that the environment creates complexion. It's not automatic. It's part of an environmental descent of the species. And Blakey says, a man told me he knew a man in Jamaica that from I can't quite read it, that from a Black woman he raised by incest children as white as himself, and he lived to see them. He died a very old man. This could take a lot of unpacking, and I'll leave it at that. But he's clearly intrigued by this issue of racial mixture. And he doesn't, I don't read this as a statement of being appalled in any way. He's intrigued and undoubtedly looks around him in Virginia and knows many people who fit the description of mixed race people, many people. So that is also intriguing. So I'll wrap up by noting the importance of the legacy of the Latin essay itself. So here you've got the published version, and what people are actually reading, because they have no access to the Latin essay whatsoever, and then they're reacting to it in these very striking different ways. And then the Latin essay itself is something that remains an important symbol, kind of a touchstone for the abolitionists as they went on. And these are just a couple of examples. For one thing, reprints of the essay, and what you see on the left is the French reprint of SN the Policy, which included an abridgment of the Latin essay, referring to Cambridge right on the title page there. And then on the right, a Swedish reprint translation, 1796, referring to the Cambridge Prize right on the title page here. Clarkson had a number of Swedish abolitionist colleagues, by the way. Then new editions in Philadelphia, 1804. This one's owned by Benjamin Rush's son. These are at the Library Company of Philadelphia. Benjamin Rush's son, James Rush, on the left. And then on the right is a fascinating edition published in Kentucky in 1816. If anybody wants to know more about this edition, I'm happy to talk about why it's there. Owned by John Breckinridge, likely, I think I've identified the proper Breckinridge, definitely a member of the famous and very powerful slaveholding Breckinridge family. On the left, you have a non-slaveholder, on the right, you have a slaveholder. It shows up in private catalogs as the volume that's all about the Latin essay. And that's the second section there from George Dillwyn's private inventory of his own books. This is out at Haverford College. And Dillwyn was the brother of William Dillwyn, who's an expat and a major figure in London abolition. And he's carefully citing, this one won the Latin Prize. Here it is in a corporate catalog of the New York Historical Society. Clarkson's Slavery translated from a Latin dissertation, won the first prize at Cambridge, 1785, in the catalog for the New York Historical Society, 1813. And then memorials refer to the Latin essay. This is a eulogy much later by Alexander Crummell, major figure in the New York intellectual circles, Black intellectual circles. He then migrated to Britain and became the first known Black graduate of Cambridge University as an American minister. And he gave, before he left, he did a eulogium in honor of Clarkson's memory, and refers there to Clarkson's experience in writing the essay and how dramatic it was. As he says, I have no language, this is Crummell speaking, I have no language by which to express adequately the intense and painful interest excited by the subject of slavery in Mr. Clarkson's mind as he wrote the Latin essay. And again, there it is, the Latin essay. And this is a remarkable piece. This is from Syracuse University Library. Friends of Freedom broadside issued by the Anti-Slavery Association of Leeds, UK, Leeds, Britain, 1854, in which they offer a prize award to anyone who can write the best essay about slavery in America. That was about the United States. Britain had abolished slavery in the West Indies by this time, and it's all about America. And why are they offering a prize essay? Because of the extraordinary result of a prize essay in awakening the mind of Thomas Clarkson, turning his whole energies into the anti-slavery field. You know, Clarkson did it, you can too. It opens up into the big broadside with a description of Clarkson's experience of writing the Latin essay. Well, should you think that this story is over, here is the Peter Peckard Memorial Prize of 2025. Magdalen College invites undergraduate students at the University of Cambridge to submit entries for the annual Peckard, this is the vice chancellor who was Clarkson's teacher, the Peckard Memorial Prize, which recognizes outstanding we're reading essays on modern day slavery and exploitation. Why? Where did that idea come from? Well, in 1784, Peckard set the undergraduate essay prize topic. Is it ever right to make slaves of others against their will? Thomas Clarkson, then a scholar at St. John's College, won the prize for the essay that exposed the brutal realities of slavery. Deeply affected by his research, Clarkson dedicated his life to the abolitionist movement. This is a ongoing essay contest today at Cambridge University. So when we say there's a legacy for the Latin essay, there's a legacy. People are very aware of the power of that story. So the question remains, does the fame of the Latin essay derive exclusively from the reader response, such as I described, to the multiple print editions of Essay on Slavery? In fact, Clarkson doesn't write about his personal experience in Essay on the Slavery. He doesn't talk about it except very passingly about people coming eager for him to publish the essay. So where does all this detail come from? It comes from, well, here's an example, for example, 1854 broadside again. The anticipation of winning the essay, let's get that right, were dampened. They're quoting Clarkson. The anticipating of winning the prize were dampened by the horrible and astounding facts that presented themselves continually to his view. It was a continued succession of perpetual woe and misery. They're describing his literal experience of learning about slavery that he then turned into the Latin. And naught but gloomy scenes of mental agony and bodily anguish were before him from early morn to dusky night. This is on that big broadside from Leeds, England. Where is this coming from? Well, here's Clarkson in his words. But all my pleasures were damped by the facts which were now continually before me. It was but one gloomy subject from morning till night. In the daytime I was uneasy, in the night I had little rest. I sometimes never closed my eyes for grief. Very, very powerful set of discussions of his own emotional turmoil. Well, where does this come from? From him. Obviously, he said it, but he also wrote it in his History of the Abolition of the Slave Trade, very famous memoir-style history that he published in 1808. It's quoted constantly by scholars all the time up into our own day. And it forward the story of how painful it was to him to learn, not least of all from Anthony Benezet back in Philadelphia. He found a copy of one of Benezet's major works and all the research he did to write the original Latin essay, It's all set out in his memoir history, and people picked up on it right away and were taken by the story of the young student converted to anti-slavery. The moral of the legacy of the Latin essay then is Clarkson's true contributions from our perspective to abolition were his printed works, which were remarkable and very influential at the time, 1780s to early 1790s. And then, of course, his works later on, including his abolition history. He provided unprecedented investigations into the greatest injustice of the age, and he produced a remarkable body of work based on that. But he perhaps knew that any social justice movement, just as in any social justice movement, just as in any political or religious movement, nothing has quite the power of persuasion as the story of an individual's conversion to the cause. Nothing has quite that power. In our own time, we must simply hope that the cause is a righteous one. The end.
Over here and field some questions. Thank you both. Lot to chew on here, and we will start as we often do with Lilian Weisberg.
Thank you so much. Oh, it's a powerful presentation. In the very first slide that you showed the cover of the Clarkson manuscript, I believe, and also the Wedgwood symbol. And I would like to ask a question, because the Wedgwood symbol of the kneeling slave has its model from a title page by Salomon Gessner, a Swiss author who wrote a drama. He was famous for his idols, a drama on Cain and Abel. And according to the biblical story, one is black. And on the title page, you have the kneeling brother asking to be from God. The book was extremely popular in England. Gessner, by the way, was also a China dealer, so he had relationship with them. So what you have is a biblical source from the question about the brother to the image in the image. But in Clarkson, you have not mentioned any references to the Bible, but references to Latin text, natural law, and so on and so forth. So I would like to know something of the competition during the abolition movement, between the Enlightenment, Latin, whatever, trajectory, natural law, happiness, whatever, and the biblical reception. How did that cross?
You want to take that or you want?
I'll start and you finish.
Yeah,
How about that? This is actually something we've talked about as we were laying out the book, and it's very strange. And it's strange first and foremost because Clarkson is in the process of being ordained as an Anglican minister. Now we can make our Episcopalian jokes about Anglican, just them not being very religious in general, and indeed Clarkson does not seem very committed to his career in the Anglican Church. But given how much theology he's read and how much time he's spent with biblical texts, it's clearly a deliberate omission. Why is this the case? It's unclear because by this point in the 18th century, we really don't have that Athens versus Jerusalem divide in philology yet. Of classics people only talk about classics, and Christianity people only talk about Christianity. But where you do get so much of this biblical discourse is basically everywhere else in the abolition movement, right? I mean, think about someone like Wilberforce, for instance, who's very connected with this sort of charismatic proto-evangelical Christianity. Yeah. And I'm not sure, I'm honestly just not quite sure why Clarkson doesn't do that, because I don't recall him anywhere specifically talking about why he doesn't bring in this model.
Scripture.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, he doesn't explain it at all. And part of it is that Cambridge itself was heavily focused on education in mathematics, natural history, natural sciences, and then the other major influence was the Scottish Enlightenment, which focused strongly on sensibility and political economy. And those are the things that seem to have appealed, especially to Clarkson, that combination of sensibility and political economy. One of his big influences and mentors was James Ramsay, who's a little known Scottish Enlightenment writer. He's not an elevated academic, he's another minister, but he wrote a very important essay against slavery that right before Clarkson published, that Clarkson lived at his parish for a while, a very important influence on him. And he's a minister and he uses biblical language, but he's especially focused on this sort of Scottish Enlightenment focus on statistics and economics and profit and so forth, why it is that it's so hard to get the plantation owners to give this up. And he doesn't talk that much about the scripture. So I think it's just a moment in English Anglican history when things have become very secularized. And this, of course, is why I think movements like the Methodists are so popular, because they're filling a bit of a void there for your average, English person in American. But they're also very passionate forms of Christianity. Wilberforce was an evangelical Christian, but still an Anglican. He was a member of the Anglican Church. And Clarkson was not. There's constant association between the two. They worked to get together, but they were in very different worlds, and they admired each other. Probably Clarkson admired Wilberforce more than the other way around, I would bet. But there's often the misunderstanding that these two were allied, working like partners. It was nothing like that at all. This is a major group effort going on, and Wilberforce is in Parliament, and Liceat is working to influence Parliament, and Clarkson is their chief author. And it's all to get all that material out to the public so that the public will petition Parliament and Wilberforce.
Yeah, me. You have mentioned the importance of images for these. So it's interesting that the image steps in. That the image steps in, because Wedgwood's image is also in the reception of the Clarkson essay. So here we have the image that is doing the biblical references that Clarkson does.
Well, I think that likely, I don't know, I'd love to talk to you about the quotation, "Am I not a man and a brother," that surrounds the image, because that appears in one of Peter Peckard's sermons. He has a sermon called "Am I not a man and a brother?" So maybe Peter Peckard is getting it from this other source. I'm not familiar with that.
The kneeling slave.
Yeah,
The kneeling slave.
the kneeling slave. Yeah, that's very interesting.
Okay, Davida, please.
Thank you for a really interesting pair of talks. So I'm a scholar of rhetoric, and in rhetoric, we talk about, why is it that something takes off and just sort of goes viral, if we want to use the common parlance. And a lot of it is because some kind of communication happens to meet the moment that there's the kairos is that the movement was already underway, and the imprimatur of a young man winning the Latin prize at Cambridge gave it that extra spark. He's not just any old aspiring Anglican minister that sets it off. But the piece of it that I'm kind of interested in hearing more about, and maybe it's in the book, is I've given lots of essay prizes and read many. Lots of times the same prompt is given many years in a row, and you get, I don't know how many people would have submitted essays to this contest, and there must have been Latin prizes given to essays on maybe other topics that could have been somewhat related or whatever. So my interest is, is there an idea that the abolitionists were looking to seize on something and say that they took this Latin essay, or Clarkson himself exploited the moment to try to get some publicity, move himself forward into the ranks?
Well, I wouldn't say he made much of it after this early. So the early movement of abolition, I recommend Christopher Brown's wonderful book, Moral Capital, for a background on this. The it stops in the 1790s because of the outbreak of the French and English wars, and then returns with abolition of the slave trade in 1807 for a host of different reasons. And he's writing his memoir story, his history of the abolition of slave trade, in 1808. So he's not using it at the time, but I do believe that the Liceat group is definitely using the Cambridge connection. You want to say?
No, it really seems that Clarkson's publisher is chopping at the bit for this. I mean, also, and you mentioned these essay contests, and I think there's at least three other 18th century essay contests, more or less, on this topic. I mean, the first one that we've traced is in Bordeaux in 1741. That's the Curran and Gates book. And people are asking this question in this competitive forum, but I think it's precisely this year, 1784, that matters, because this is happening after the American Revolution. And it's happening after you have this effectively very large manumission event that's happening in North America.
Did the person who set the exam question talk about choosing it, or other essays that why this one won?
Oh, well, we don't know the detail of that, except Peter Peckard was part of this group of early abolitionists in London exactly at that time. So the Quakers and Anglicans were cooperating at this point, and Peckard is one of those. And it's obviously very much a part of their plan to bring attention to the subject of slavery.
Right, because that 1784 manumission event you're talking about is Pennsylvania's Gradual Abolition Act. So that's so you actually think there's a first Atlantic impact that may have sparked the contest, or at least Clarkson's thinking.
They're constant communication. And the thing is that the British, they loved using slavery as a, kind of a, whatever you want to call it, a way to put down Americans who say they're fighting for liberty, and yet they are slaveholders. That there's a big moral fight that goes on there where the British are feeling very superior. And it's part and parcel of that as well, is to show Americans that the British can be like this, can be morally superior in some way.
Yeah, I'll just tack on a follow-up question.
But they're
because-
very much,
Yeah.
the Philadelphians and the Londoners are totally in contact with each other. Yeah.
So Jim Duffin and I have found two examples, one as early as the 1760s, I think 66, and one from 1780-81 of Latin disputations at Penn at this institution
Yes, yeah,
on slavery.
yeah,
And we don't have texts.
yeah.
And we have published notices in the paper. So I guess the question is, this is everybody had to write an essay in your case, and so the disputatio tradition that I understand is public.
So this-
contest of- yeah, so tell us
So
about.
this one's judged, it's all on paper. And as far as we know, it was completely anonymous. The way that instead of having names on the submissions, every author would choose a decontextualized Latin quotation. And so for this essay, I believe it's more or less a random quotation from Book 8 of Livy. And they would have a list of who got what place by the list of quotations,
Yeah.
basically. All the submissions were destroyed afterwards. Which actually raises a question about what is manuscript B doing. Manuscript A clearly could not have been submitted because it's a really ugly manuscript. Manuscript B is a very pretty manuscript and it's basically finished, but it should have been destroyed. So either somehow this was spared from fire, or something else was submitted
Yeah,
together.
somebody copied
Yeah.
it for him
Yeah.
as a memento.
So there are no other surviving other essays by other people at other
No.
dates.
No, I mean there's the really famous competition at Harvard in 1772 because there's that critical inquiry article about it, like in 2019.
Yeah.
But it's pretty rare to have that many surviving disputation essays.
And this was voluntary. This was not like an exam at the end of the academic year. You chose to compete in the members' prize.
I mean, the Penn cases are public
Yeah,
commencement ceremonies, debate.
yeah,
Which is
yeah.
not exactly the same.
yeah.
Anyway,
He
sorry.
spoke,
Yeah.
he delivered it once he won.
So there is an oral component.
But not a
So
debate.
there is an oral
Yeah.
component.
Yes, yeah, he went back to the Senate House at Cambridge
Yes, he
to
did, yeah.
deliver it, but there wasn't a debate.
Peter's been waiting quite patiently.
Sorry, didn't mean, please, yeah.
Peter's been waiting.
Yeah, I'm gonna shut up now and we'll take Peter and then Jerry. Hi, Peter.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation.
Peter?
My question is,
That's on us. Hold on, Peter. We're having some audio problems.
okay, can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
I can't hear you.
My sound's on.
We got you now, Peter. Start again. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. My question for both of you is about the relationship between Latin and internationalism. And I'm thinking about the kind of tendency to see Latin as always fading, as always disappearing. I grew up with that anyway. And yet there are certain areas that it never has faded, above all at the Vatican at the moment. In other words, that Pete Van Boxel, for instance, who's often presented at this seminar, was a priest. He's no longer a priest, but he actually had to speak in Latin at the Vatican. You have to actually learn Latin, and that is the lingua franca of the Vatican. So my question is about these translations, the French, German, and Swedish translations, and would they be, some of these translators, would they actually be genuinely using the Latin rather than the English? In other words, that many humanists might be more comfortable, if they're Swedish, with Latin than they would be with English. In other words, I don't know. So the problem with the vernacular is it's a very divisive. Vernaculars are radically divisive, and that's one of the whole histories of humanism, is that you want to have a community of people who have a common language. So the question is, that's on the one hand, and on the second aspect of this is particularly the relationship with France. And a new moment of internationalism. Joseph Priestley was actually asked to join the French National Assembly. The correspondence about that is at Penn, so you can actually see the correspondence of Joseph Priestley. He turned them down, but the notion of a guy being invited to join a National Assembly is staggering. One of the reasons why he turned it down was because he didn't speak fluent French. But he might have been happier if it had been a Latin assembly. So the question anyway is really about the status of Latin. It's obviously it has cultural prestige, but I'm wondering about the practice, the actual, like at the Vatican today. I mean, is there really, are some of these people writing to each other in Latin too?
So as far as we know, this essay never circulated in Latin. And so this would seem to be a pretty simple case of symbolic use of Latin. People clearly heard it read at Cambridge at the Senate House. But we have no reports of anyone actually seeing this manuscript up until like the 1930s, I think, right?
Yeah, well, yes,
Yeah.
yes, from Clarkson's descendants passed it on to the Atlanta University.
Yeah.
Library.
Now, there is sort of a simple reason why the Latin ends up not being very useful for an international audience, which is that the essay on the slavery, as we have it in the first edition and then the expanded second edition, is over 2/3 longer than the Latin essay. So there's a huge amount of content added when it's rewritten in English that's just simply not there in the Latin. Almost all of the Latin is there, and in particular
in Clarkson's English integrated into it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely integrated into the English, but they really are different essays. And one thing Clarkson does try to do in his personal myth making is say that this entire thing is written in Latin and then it's translated to English with some modifications. But it really, some additions, yeah, like 66%. They really are quite different, and particularly in their use of facts, data, and things like that, which do not appear, or all but don't appear in the Latin version.
Yeah. But I think to answer Peter's, to pursue your remark further, I think the idea that there was an original Latin essay is appealing internationally. So it's the idea of it, not that in fact you're going to read any Latin when you buy Essay on the Slave. You're going to read one sentence on the title page or the Libby quote or whatever.
Yeah.
That's all you're going to get. But the idea that he wrote this in a universal language, I think that's a really interesting point that I hadn't thought about before. It is certainly the case that the abolitionists are aiming for an international cooperation. The British and the French abolitionists share material about the slave trade and their, people they consider to be criminals in either nation involved in the slave trade. They share all this material back and forth with each other. You'd think that they'd feel that there's some prerogative or ways in which English people should not share stuff with French people. They have no compunctions about this. Then in the 1790s, Lafayette, who had given up his title, he was no longer the Marquis, but Lafayette wrote to Clarkson and said, what we need, this is after Clarkson had temporarily retired. They said, what we need is an international meeting of nations to settle the slave trade issue. We need an international meeting. It's a highly modern idea of cooperation. So I think the Latin, I had never thought about this, that the Latin connection, is in some senses reflecting a kind of modern ambition for universality.
Yeah. Jared.
Thank you so much. Seminar and material text. I have a material question, or rather asking whether you could tell us a bit more about manuscript A, which is clearly not a holograph of Clarkson's. You refer to it as a rough draft, but I think you also said that it's in multiple hands, which doesn't make sense for a rough draft of a student paper. So what is manuscript A?
Yeah, and we've sort of had different thoughts about this. Let me get the yeah. Let me get this my slideshow back open.
I have no recollection of the differences.
So here's our best picture of manuscript A. So basically, the way we went and identified hands through this essay is that up to basically the first half of the essay is written in a relatively formal, relatively slowly. It becomes more slanted and more sloppy as it goes on, and then abruptly it ends, and then switches to a hand, which is much more measured throughout. Now, it could be the same person writing in different emotional states, etc. Also, the Latin and Greek is in different handwriting, which looks a lot like Clarkson's normal hand.
Yeah.
But it's very odd because there's all sorts of other stuff in manuscript A that, for instance, it has this epigraph which is crossed out, which you can actually see here. It has a title in English which is crossed out, which he says up here on the left, on the origin of government, which almost suggests that this essay is supposed to be some sort of Lockean state of nature exercise, which it sort of is, but it really goes in quite a different direction. But it's odd, and I can't quite explain everything that's going on there.
Yeah.
What I would say is that manuscript B, it basically looks like a much more thought out exercise that has been carried out from start to finish.
But it's definitely not in his hand, B, you know that.
Yeah, that's what you think.
Yeah, I
So B is definitely not in his hand, but you think A, again,
Sort of.
A is possibly in his hand, or definitely not in his hand, or parts of it are in his.
The Latin Greek really looks like his handwriting, yeah.
Okay, but the,
But the rest of it, yeah, they are definitely two hands.
Yeah.
There's ours.
but you assume because it was burned that it was in his possession because he.
Oh yeah, so
Do we have other signs of provenance that this belonged to him?
yeah, so we as a sign of provenance, we take this epigraph, which is written on basically on a separate piece of paper that is part of the manuscript, where he dedicates it to his son, and he gives this little devotional message. His grandson, and he gives this little devotional message, which would strongly suggest that it was in his possession as late at possibly up to his death. The burning is a little bit mysterious because there's definite burn marks, but most of it looks fine, and manuscript B isn't burned at all. And so we know that he was going through and burning his papers in sort of different tranches in the last decade of his life. But it's sort of why he's doing this. Hard to tell.
Yeah, he describes it as partially in my hand.
Yeah.
But I mean, is it possibly a later document that he's fiddling with rather than a first draft?
This is a good question, and I really don't know. There's just not enough contextual clues really.
I would just be cautious about calling it a first draft.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, good point. Very
Yeah,
good point. And it seems to me that the B is probably somebody copied it for him. You know, he had it, maybe took it to an amanuensis in town, and they.
Despite the strict prohibitions that you just said about these essays, if they're all to be destroyed, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Anyway, Karen.
Are there any other disputationists in the 18th century that are concerned with issues of moral gravity equivalent to slavery and abolition?
I would say that they're all deeply moral in some way. And I would say they're basically moral in the sense that there's very, very limited what we would call statistical or data evidence appearing in these exercises whatsoever. What are they writing about? So, I mean, the one that's been most useful for us is that there's a very famous series of disputations that take place in France in the 1840s about the origin, the 1740s, yes, about the origin of skin color, which present, very wide range of theories ranging from biblical explanations like Mark of Cain, etc., all the way down to sort of pseudoscientific, sun exposure, things like that. As far as other topics,
Which is sort of a parallel area to slavery.
Indeed, yeah, and slavery.
Let me play my cards.
Yeah.
The reason I'm raising this is that I'm wondering whether it isn't that abolition was so important that it needed Latin to
Mhm.
market it as a significant issue to be addressed, but rather Latin needed abolition.
Oh, I
Because
see.
it's on the way out. It's no longer, as you say, the language of instruction, and performance pieces have a kind of artificial quality.
Yeah.
As you well know, the
Yeah.
earlier rhetorical tradition is full of these training exercises that are so stupid.
Yeah.
You don't have your
So,
students
as
do
you
this?
be by pirates, argue for your release. You know, a little. And I'm wondering whether abolition didn't come along at exactly the moment when Latin and the people who are in a Latinate culture are actually finding an issue that really gains and gives value to Latin rather than Latin gives value to it, or if you want to put it recursively.
Yeah, no, that's a spectacular way to frame it. And it's giving me a lot to think about. I would like that framing. I have to think about how much more anti-slavery Latin do we have? There's not.
I don't, there's the French contests in.
Those are great.
I can
Yeah,
read
yeah.
this earlier part of this work. The French contest, very famous in the 1780s, again, on slavery, but I think they were in French. This is part of the prize culture in France, which was very big. Prizes administered by academies throughout France, and anybody could compete in them, including, that's where a number of these figures made their first public appearance, including Rousseau, including Robespierre, including Brissot. They all competed in these public events in Paris. There's a wonderful book, and I'll have to remember the name of the author, about all this, about the French disputes. But I think that, I mean, debates, but I think they were all in French. I'm sure they were. But other things, I think probably the Harvard ones were in Latin.
I believe they were in Latin.
Do you know about?
I mean, there's another phenomenon too, which is that there is kind of a revival of Latin prose at the end of the 18th century in medical writing. I mean, if you were to like search Latin texts in early English texts online, I mean, the majority of non-classical edition Latin texts from like 1775 on are people who are doing anatomy. And there it's very clearly being used as like an international language, but also a scientific language, which is a and oftentimes very non-moralistic. And so it is interesting at this precise moment, we have this highly moralizing Latin text about a political issue being written when Latin's going in this kind of like technical direction as far as new Latin prose being written.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, the scientific example is a good one because like astronomy and other scientific things it was an international language. And I happen to know about one case where Neville Maskelyne, who was the astronomer royal in Greenwich, was producing almanacs, and he was corresponding with people all over the world because he needed observations from of the moon and distance of moon from stars and things. And I think it continued even through the war with France, and there were French editions of the almanac that were produced with his help. So it was still very vital at that point to certain.
Interesting. Yeah, very interesting. Yeah.
I'm going to suggest that, at least for those of us in the room, we break and look at these amazing books that Dee has selected for us, and thank our speakers.
Thank you.
Total pleasure. You have to start over here in this corner.